One of my favorite things in our local newspaper, which is called the Republican, even though the editor is a Democrat. But one of my favorite things is the yesteryear column, and you've seen them all if you've ever subscribed to a local newspaper. The 10 years ago today column, 25 years ago, 50 years ago. This week's yesteryear column took us back to 1971, when it mentioned that all my family but me went to Vincennes to celebrate my sister's birthday at my grandparents', dredging up yet another painful memory of childhood exclusion. I took a picture of the column and sent it to my siblings and asking them, why didn't I go to Vincennes with all of you? And my brother Glenn texted back, because you're adopted. My brother Glenn has told me this my entire life, and I've never believed it, though now I can't help but wonder. Despite the potential for ridicule, I really enjoy the yesteryear column. Just this week, I was reminded that 43 years ago tomorrow, on March 22nd, 1978, the high wire walker, Kurt Wallenda, the patriarch of the Flying Wallendas, died after falling from a high wire. He was 73 years old, which was too old to be monkeying around on high wires, but good luck telling some men they're too old to do something. I remember when it happened because Wallenda was the same age as my grandfather Hank, who lived in Vincennes. And I remember telling my grandpa, well, he's too old to do that. And my grandpa scolding me for saying that Wallenda was too old to be walking on a wire 120 feet above the street. You're only as old as you think you are, Grandpa told me. And he kept saying that right up until Wallenda lost his balance and fell to his death. After that, Grandpa didn't have much to say, nor for that matter did Wallenda. Carl Wallenda lost his balance. Isn't that an interesting turn of phrase, to lose one's balance? I remember losing my balance once. I was pastoring full time, cranking out books, traveling nonstop, and never seeing my family until I ended up on a therapist's couch and quitting my pastoral job and staying home so much that after a while, Joanne began to ask, don't you have somewhere to go to give a speech? The thing is, once you've lost your balance and then regained it, you realize that keeping your balance is a lifelong process. You don't just regain your balance once and for all and have it the rest of your life. You don't keep it forever with no further effort. Life, in fact, is a balancing act. Last week, we turned our thoughts to the habits of wholeness, those customs, patterns, and behaviors that help us become what we were created to become. And today, I'd like us to think about the habit of balance. By balance, I mean giving each aspect of our lives its proper weight, place, and priority, lest we lose our sense of equilibrium and collapse. And I use the word collapse very intentionally because in my experience, that is precisely what happens when our lives become out of balance. We eventually collapse. Eventually, something collapses, perhaps a significant relationship, our mental well-being, our happiness, or maybe even our vocation. When we are out of balance, something always fails. You can bet on it. For many of us, This failure or collapse is sometimes the first indication that our life is unbalanced. We have gained some temporary benefit by our imbalance, so are slow to recognize its hazards and costs. Whether that temporary benefit is wealth or prestige or ego fulfillment or power or the admiration of others, but it feels good. And so we persist in our unbalanced behavior because it pays off until it doesn't. Until it doesn't. And then we collapse or fail or fall. But that doesn't have to happen because there are usually signs or signals that our lives are out of balance, out of kilter. I know, for instance, that when I become persistently angry, when anger is my go-to emotion, that it probably means I haven't spent enough time in by myself in quiet reflection. I know that if I am physically exhausted, it usually means I have neglected rest and exercise and fresh air. I know that if I am spiritually fatigued, it usually means I have become too cynical and pessimistic and am spending time with people who wear me out instead of people who inspire me. I know that if I catch myself exaggerating my success or accomplishments, it usually means my ego has eclipsed my morality and I need to reassess my priorities. But why do we have to wait until our lives are near collapse before we act? Why can't we act now to bring needed and healthy balance to our lives? Here are some thoughts. If all your waking hours are spent pursuing wealth, perhaps it is time you volunteer to help other people. If all your meals are rushed, perhaps it's time you savored an unhurried meal with family and friends, provided they're immunized. If you're around negative people day in and day out, maybe it's time you spend some time with wise and healthy people. If you're suffering from depression, it might be prudent to see a doctor, talk to a therapist, begin an exercise program, adopt a pet, volunteer to help someone else, spend more time outside, plant a garden, clean your house, renew a meaningful relationship, lessen your screen time, or listen to music. Just a thought. My mind has been returning to Vincennes this week, remembering our family trips there when I was a kid. I'd always had to stay at my grandmother Gulley's house. And that was a mixed blessing because she was a very persnickety woman and didn't like me to touch her things. She had a very immaculate, beautiful house, everything in its proper place. And when you're a little kid and you want to touch things and play things, and she's always telling me no, you feel real stifled. But there was one thing she always let me play with, and that was this. Look at this, an audio-visual aid. Can you see that? It's a scale. It's an old-timey poster scale. And that's what she would let me play with. She would set it on her kitchen table and let me weigh things. And it had 4 little weights, a 2-ounce weight, a 1-ounce weight, a 1/2 ounce, and a 1/4 ounce. And I loved playing with that scale, seeing if I could strike a perfect balance and get the needle pointing to dead center. To dead center. Now there's another interesting term, centered. Centered. Maybe that's what balance is. Centered. being centered. My grandmother died in 1989 after a funeral. We all gathered at her house to clean it up and get it ready to sell. My Aunt Doris held up Grandma's postage scale and asked if anyone wanted it. No one did but me. So now it sits in my office on my shelf beside my desk as a reminder of balance. Whenever Madeline comes into my office, it's the first thing she goes to every time without fail. So I'm hoping she'll learn balance too. Religion, spirituality at its best is concerned with balance. We Quakers call it being centered or living from the center. I have a Pentecostal friend who speaks of being in the spirit, and a Chinese acquaintance who quotes the I Ching about the dynamic balance of opposites. We have the language for it. We have the language of balance down pat. What remains to be seen is whether we have the aptitude for it, or without it, we can never be whole. Without it, we can never be whole. Friends, let's enter into centering worship.